Hello, thank you for joining us today for the first event in a series we're hosting here at CNAS this fall on climate change and national security. I'm Paul Shari, the Vice President and Director of Studies here at the Center for New American Security. Here at CNAS, we are committed to strong, pragmatic, and principled approaches to the most pressing defense and national security issues. We have teams that focus on a range of global challenges, including defense strategy and operational concepts, technology and national security, military personnel policy, energy and economic issues, homeland security, as well as regional issues on the Indo-Pacific, transatlantic, and Middle East regions. But there is perhaps no more cross-cutting challenge facing each of these areas than climate change. Climate change poses direct challenges to national security as an accelerant of global crises, from extreme weather events and natural disasters to water scarcity, food shortages, pressure on vulnerable societies, and human migration. How nations respond to threats from climate change also has major consequences for geopolitics. The world is already roiling today with energy shocks and food shortages from the war in Ukraine. Climate change will exacerbate and complicate many of these challenges, and nations will respond to them and are responding to them already in very different ways. But within these challenges, there are also opportunities, not just to transition the global energy supply and mitigate the impacts from climate change, but also to harness geopolitical competition constructively, for example, through a race to the top on clean tech. The global cross-cutting challenges that climate change poses forces us to develop new solutions, and in these solutions are opportunities. Our discussion today will focus on how climate change is affecting the U.S. military. Our expert panelists will address the effects of climate change on basing resilience and the availability of training installations, demands for National Guard and Reserve capacity to assist in hurricane and wildfire relief, and even rates of heat injury among service members. Today's event focuses on the strategic and operational impacts of climate change on the U.S. military. We'll have another event later this fall looking at regional issues. Now, to give a brief overview of the format for today's event, we'll have two panels today. The first panel will be on strategic issues, second panel digging into operational issues. I'm very excited to introduce our first panel, which will be led by Dr. Stacey Pettyjohn, Senior Fellow and Director of the CNAS Defense Program, and Emily Kilcrease, Senior Fellow and Director of the CNAS Energy, Economics, and Security Program. I'm going to give a brief bio about the two of you, so forgive me and hold on. Dr. Pettyjohn, who runs our defense program, prior to joining CNAS, she spent over a decade at the RAND Corporation, where she most recently was the director of the Strategy and Doctrine Program at Project Air Force. She's written widely on defense strategy, budgeting, posture infrastructure, U.S. operational concepts, and the role of air power in recent campaigns. Emily Kilcrease is the Senior Fellow and Director of the CNAS Energy, Economics, and Security Program. Prior to joining CNAS, Emily was the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative overseeing U.S. foreign investment policy. She has extensive government experience on economic policy and trade issues, including working on CFIUS and at the Commerce Department. So welcome, Stacey and Emily.
Thanks, Paul. I'm very excited to be a part of this first panel today and to introduce our two speakers. First, we have Admiral John Richardson, who served for 37 years in the Navy and ended his career as the Chief of Naval Operations, which was a position that he held from 2015 to 2019. He also was the director of the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program from 2012 to 2015. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Stacey.
To join him, we have Daniel Silverberg, who is an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS. He also serves as Capstone's managing director of corporate practice and co-leads the Capstone National Security Team. Daniel previously had an illustrious career on the Hill, serving as a senior advisor for House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer and on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome to you both. I'm going to kick things off here where I'm going to pose the same question to both of you and then drill down a little bit and ask John a few more questions. So to start off this conversation, how should we be thinking about or framing climate change as a national security issue? John, I'm going to turn to you first.
Okay, thanks, Stacey, and thanks very much for hosting this event and for inviting me to participate. I'm really amongst some pretty lofty company here, but I'll do my best to hold my own. In terms of framing this, I think that even in the time since I retired from the Navy in 2019, it's really become clear that this is an urgent global and national security problem, right? I mean, most people, I think, are past the anger and denial stage, which I think was a characteristic even as short a time ago as 2019. And I think we're seeing also that it's going to stress, just as Paul said, some of the very basics of national security. I mean, if you think about, some of the fundamental responsibilities of a government to provide food, water, shelter, those sorts of things, when because of climate change, drought, migrations of fish, rivers drying up, those sorts of things. When a government is unable to provide some of these basics, the governed, I think, will just suffer a massive loss of credibility in their governing body, right? And so, what choices will they make after that, right? I think is a big question for us. And then I think also since I retired, of course, we've had the pandemic. In many ways, sort of a cross-cutting issue, just like climate change. And what we saw was that those leaders who tended towards authoritarianism really used that opportunity to strengthen their hold. There was a real acceleration towards authoritarian types of structures during the pandemic as they tightened up freedom of movement, as they used the pandemic to increase surveillance, sometimes enforcing those with violent means, and using misinformation. And so I think that nations are going to be held to task, I guess, in terms of how they respond to this by their people. We had a little bit of a foreshadowing. The United Nations Human Rights Committee just recently ruled that Australia failed to protect the people living on 4 islands in the Torres Straits from the effects of climate change, right? And it has held them accountable and ordered them to pay for damages. And the people in these islands off the northern tip of Australia were losing land. They were losing their traditional food sources and also culturally significant sites by virtue of sea level rise. It's the first successful claim of its kind, but I think it portends, sort of a trend in terms of how governments are going to be questioned by their people and how they're going to respond to that. I think will be really very strategic indeed.
Thanks for those thoughts, John. Your comments resonate with what we heard from the Biden administration with their national security strategy, which was just released yesterday, in terms of thinking about the competition between autocracies and democracies, but at the same time, the need to cooperate on these cross-cutting issues that affect everyone. Daniel, I'd like to turn to you now to get your thoughts on how you think we should be framing climate change as a national security issue.
Sure, and thank you for having me, and Admiral Richardson. It's really an honor to be with you. I sat in a number of briefings that you participated in and led on the Hill, and I think it's fair to say you had an outstanding reputation among us staffers. So, thank you. In one light, Stacey, I think we've done it in the 5 minutes of this event so far. I think Paul used terrific language in saying not only is climate change a moral imperative, a threat, but it's an exacerbant of national security challenges. And Admiral Richardson really laid out the strategic implications and opportunities that climate change could provide, actually an opportunity to negotiate, to cooperate with some of our most challenging adversaries. But that said, and I really am optimistic for a number of reasons, but that said, I'll be honest, I don't know the right language or how to frame this in a way that is actually going to do what we need in the defense context. The passage of the Inflation Reduction Act was a huge development. That is a game changer in terms of the country overall. But in the national security context, I am not sure what needs to happen so that the Pentagon feels not only the political mandate to make serious changes on climate resilience, which I think it feels that, but where it also feels like it has the resources to implement the policies that it has articulated. And I'll give you one example of where, frankly, I'm frustrated. And I think a lot of folks on the Hill feel the same way. The Armed Services Committee for years has been signaling the threat that climate change poses. And they've done it based on year after year of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the head of the intelligence community coming up and unequivocally saying that climate change poses an imminent national security threat. But then when you look at the specifics of what the committees have the political mandate to do, it's not much. It is a few reporting requirements in the NDAA every year. It's a few references in appropriations and maybe some money for installation resilience, but not the kind of massive fiscal investment in overhauling both what the Pentagon buys and how it buys it. So in short, I am optimistic we are framing it in the right way. There are plenty of opportunities for broad cooperation on the diplomatic front on climate change, and yet there remains a very serious gap when it comes to our own U.S. national security implementation of dealing with the climate change challenge.
Thanks for that, Daniel. Yeah, strategy implementation is always the difficult piece. And I know some people were really concerned. Some critics were very concerned that a lot of money would be diverted in the defense budget to climate. And really, when you look at the numbers they've reported, which I don't recall exactly what they were, it was a very low amount. So more needs to be done. And this is another issue to add on top of acquisition reform and different processes that the department needs to improve on. John, turning back to you, when you were the CNO, you certainly had to deal with some of the consequences of climate change. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced that were the result of climate change? And you already mentioned a little bit how things have changed since that time in terms of more people recognizing the urgency of the issue. Do you see any other specific factors that have changed in the intervening years?
Yeah, well, I think it was sort of a growing awareness that some of the things that we were being called to address, in the Navy specifically, were, clearly sort of in response to climate change, right? So we sort of design and build certain facilities, piers, seawalls, those sorts of things to, it's all about risk tolerance, right? And so you can design it, for instance, for the 100-year storm, right? This is a storm that is statistically only supposed to, of such ferocity that would only happen once in 100 years. When you get sort of 4 of those in a couple of years, something's happening, right? There's something moving in the background here, and we had to do that. We learned a tremendous amount in terms of just how to sort of batten down the hatches, if you will, in the immediate change, and then having to think about peer infrastructure, those just base resilience. Also, just the capacity of the forces, right? And so when we talk about expenditure, there may not be a whole lot in the acquisition of new things, but in terms of where we operate and what we're doing, critical, I think, particularly as Daniel said, in terms of building those sorts of partnerships and alliances that are going to serve us well, across the whole national security spectrum. But you can really make some great deposits in that bank account when you show up for humanitarian assistance or disaster relief. That HADR, the urgency of climate change is putting an exclamation point on that as a mission set. And I always found that particularly when information sharing protocols are difficult, you can get an awful lot of meaningful partnership done under an HADR umbrella. It doesn't require a lot of confidential or classified data being exchanged, but you have to go out and operate, you have to communicate, you have to do all of those things that really help us work together. And so these were the sorts of things I think we were moving into, Stacy. As you said, since I retired, I mean, we've just learned so much, right? I think that, most people are convinced now that this is something that's going to have, tremendous impact on our lives. I agree with Daniel that the Inflation Reduction Act is, a real step forward in this regard. It won't surprise anybody, given my bio, that I'm sort of an advocate of nuclear. The Inflation Reduction Act was a great piece of legislation with respect to enhancing our approach to nuclear, both current and new technologies. So these types of things, I just hope that they can move faster. And I think that the Defense Department, by virtue of our experience, let's just say in nuclear, for instance, we can lead out, right, in these areas. And we, I think, know how to sort of build in a new nuclear technology, let's say, build the first 3 to 5 articles, get those all done with some government subsidies and responsible people running them. And then I think you'll see, the commercialization of all of that take off after that risk has been retired. So I think that there's a lot of sort of non-traditional, there's very traditional roles going forward in terms of responding to these crises, building resilience into our future. But I think there's also maybe some non-traditional roles in terms of, getting us through some of these technological transitions that are going to ease our situation in response to climate change in the future.
That's really interesting, thinking about the duality and sort of non-traditional missions that the department needs to pick up to deal with this. In an effort to close that say-do gap that Daniel had mentioned in terms of implementing some of these changes and making this more of a priority for the Pentagon, do you think that the DoD needs to incorporate climate into some of its core planning processes, whether it's its global posture review or the budgeting process, acquisition processes where climate is a factor that is taken into account to actually make sure that some of these changes happen?
Yeah, Stacey, I think you've got it exactly right. And, the military, we're pretty good at sort of, taking a look at an emerging situation. We can characterize it 10 ways from never, approach it. We can look at, specified and applied tasks and, all of those sorts of things. And really take a nice sober approach towards it. But you got to confront it. Try and steer clear of some of the, let's just stay focused on what is actually going to, projected to happen, right? To just confront the reality of the increased storms, the increased temperatures, the implications of those, what is actually happening. There's a whole, sort of political, social discussion happening there. I think that if we can prevent ourselves from getting too distracted about that and just, face the reality, I think that will necessarily just create a demand signal on our future that we ignore at our peril, right? I mean, I'd much rather be over conservative in that regard and be surprised in the good direction rather than be caught actually, falling further behind in that regard.
That's very true. There's likely to be consequences that have to be dealt with one way or the other. So that confirms the change. Emily, I'm going to turn things over to you here now.
Thanks, Stacey. And I want to turn to Daniel to pull out another aspect of this question that we touched on but haven't drilled down on yet, and that's energy security. No pun intended there. I think energy security is on a lot of people's minds right now when we think about global energy markets, and in particular, the situation in Europe, who is facing a very cold, hard winter coming ahead. And as part of that, there's a real interest in taking a sharp pivot towards clean energy technologies, but a lot of questions about how effectively one can implement that and how quickly one can implement that. And then certainly how one can do that without creating new dependencies on other countries where we may have geopolitical tensions, namely China, when you think about where clean energy tech is produced and where our materials come from and the like. So how do you think about these challenges and what the US government strategy needs to be over this really critical next year to make sure that we do have secure energy sources, but that we're not losing sight of this longer term goal to really make the pivot towards a strong transition on climate?
That's a great question, Emily. Thank you. First, I just want to, excuse me, add to something that Admiral Richardson said, which is I actually think the Pentagon should get high grades for its efforts to implement climate change as part of its planning and its policy process. We've already seen a number of key documents come out. Just 7 days ago, the Pentagon released its climate adaptation progress report, where it made very clear the lines of effort that it has identified to address the climate challenge, and hopefully those will filter down. Where I think the gap exists is, how do you translate that clear policy articulation, which folks like Joe Bryant and some of the service secretaries and Catholics have really taken a leadership role on? How do you translate those policy priorities into procurement priorities? And that's where the gap is right now. I think that there's going to be somewhat of a push-pull here, where Congress and the money will help steer the Pentagon. And at the same time, I think that there will be developments in the private sector that likewise will influence where the Pentagon is going. The market is going to shift on what companies are going to produce and how they produce it. And I think that gets, Emily, to your question of how do we deal with this challenge of bringing on board new technologies as quickly as possible to deal with the climate challenge. One, I as a CNAS adjunct, I shoot straight down the middle as a centrist of, I think that there has to be a continued commitment to a balanced approach. And that obviously is going to mean an embrace of fossil fuel production, ideally LNG as well, in the next couple of years. And I would add the Israel-Lebanon LNG deal that was reached over the weekend through the hard efforts of Amos Hochstein and the Biden administration and the president. That's huge. That is an example of kind of the flip side of what I was talking about before. Climate diplomacy provides an opportunity to negotiate with allies. So does LNG diplomacy in this context. So I was really pleased to see that. So number one, I think we need a balanced approach. Number two, I think we need to really implement the clean technologies that are necessary. They're very expensive. You can't have one government or one company doing it. As creative as Elon Musk is, we cannot outsource the climate revolution to one individual. There has to be some way of bringing governments together and bringing agencies and large companies together to co-invest in the type of really expensive but game-changing technologies. That means revamping how we are setting up carbon markets, the kind of carbon credits that we're providing, so that companies have an incentive to invest not just in deforestation, in reforestation, and the technologies that we know of today, but in the really sophisticated and expensive decarbonization technologies that don't yet exist and that financially are not viable under the current market conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Dana. I'm glad to hear you bring up the recent LNG deal. It's a good reminder that so much of the impacts and the political solutions to some of these questions will be regional. And I know that both you and John have written about the Arctic and kind of the importance of that and the emerging issues in that context when we think about the climate transition. But I want to ask both of you, beyond the Arctic, what are the other regions that we need to be focused on? And how will this problem set play out in key regions? And how is that going to affect how we're thinking about this set of issues on a geopolitical level? So Daniel, why don't you go first? Then I'll ask John to weigh in.
Sure. Let's stay with the Middle East for the moment. It's amazing that we're having this conversation at the exact time of this Lebanon-Israel deal and total chaos in U.S., Saudi, energy dynamics. And in one light, the Middle East always seems to be the region of frustration and headaches for U.S. policymakers. The Israel-Lebanon deal is an exception to that, but I think that there have been a few other good news stories over the past couple of years. One, I think that the UAE and Israel, through the Abraham Accords, have been engaged in all kinds of climate research, climate investment together that are going to have significant impact in the region and hopefully globally. And at risk of praising our Saudi partners at the exact time when I think that they engaged in pretty craven behavior in joining with Putin on his energy policy and putting more money in his pocket to commit war crimes in Ukraine. That said, it's worth flagging that they made some pretty serious commitments to climate investments, and those go hand in hand with investments as well in critical minerals and mining that we need desperately, of course, to diversify our supply chains. So, of course, I would look at the Middle East, and then I think China obviously is at the heart of not so much where we are going to find areas of partnership, but rather where we need to continue to be focused, consistent with the national security strategy, on diversifying our critical mineral supply chain so that we are able to ensure that our green revolution here in the US can move forward without being entirely dependent on China.
John, over to you.
Yeah, Emily, thanks. It's great following Daniel because he's just so eloquent and sort of framing this thing. I'm tempted to just say, what he said, but I'll add on a couple of things. First, if I could just go back to your question on the pivot in energy. While it is significant, and Daniel, I think, got it just right. Some of these technologies are exquisite. They're going to require a lot of investment. I think the government can play a key role in this. In fact, I think in terms of the commercialization of that, Jonas Nam put a nice report together for CNAS in terms of 4 solid recommendations in terms of how to get this done. And I'm working kind of in the civil nuclear, both the current fleet and the emerging fleet now. And these things are done. I think that people are ready to invest in this independent of government help. As long as the government can help with sort of the regulatory environment, let's get through that a little bit quicker so that there's not so much time and energy spent. Some of these startups just don't have that type of a runway. But some of these things can be done. And then, the other thing I just long to participate in is sort of the cradle to grave appreciation of some of these technologies so that we really understand, and not only cradle to grave, but the scale that's involved in these. And so, when you're talking about just massive amounts of material required, massive amounts of capability required to deploy these things, we really need to be thinking at scale. In terms of your question and, where besides the Arctic, I agree with Daniel. Unfortunately, the areas that are going to, I think, be stressed most acutely by this are the areas that are already under a tremendous amount of stress, right? And so, just look across the globe and, that equatorial region, which is just always under such tremendous stress, is going to suffer more by some of the changes that will come about by virtue of climate change. I think also, a lot of the Southern Hemisphere nations, which, their food economies and stuff are not as diverse, right? So, when I was talking to some of my counterparts, their chiefs of Navy in South America or Africa, they were very, very focused on just securing their economic zone, their exclusive economic zone, so they could have the security of the fishing and fight that IUU fishing that was going on, because it's absolutely critical to feeding their populations. I think that when those fish, it doesn't matter who's fishing, when the fish migration changes by virtue of an ocean climate or an ocean current changing, that's going to impose a lot of stress on those types of economies as well. So it's unfortunate, but the parts of the globe that are under stress right now, by virtue of any assessment, are going to come under further stress just because the climate change is going to hit those regions pretty dramatically.
Yeah, truly outlining the global nature of the problem. And thank you for saving me from having to plug our own research on industrial policy and Jonas Stum's excellent report on clean energy. We could keep going, I'm sure, but I will turn it back over to Kate now so we can bring in some of our other panelists. Thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Kuzminski. I'm the program director here at CNAS for our Military, Veterans, and Society program, where we focus on the personnel impacts and the operational impacts of defense policy. I'm pleased to be joined today by Will Rogers, who is the Senior Climate Advisor for the United States Army. Previously, he spent nearly a decade as the National Security Advisor for Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii. And I'll also note that he started his policy career here at CNAS as a research assistant working on issues of national security and climate. So welcome, Will. I'm also joined by Hope Seck, who is an award-winning investigative and enterprise defense reporter and the former managing editor of military.com. She served as an embedded reporter in Afghanistan and with the Marine Corps. And notably for this conversation, Hope has covered a wide range of operational issues, including personnel challenges within each of the services. So before I dive into my questions with our panel, I do want to note for our audience that we encourage you to submit your questions down below here on the CNAS website or on Twitter over using the hashtag CNAS 2022. So with that, I want to turn it over to Will first. Will, can you describe, first of all, the last panel focused a lot on the strategic issues of climate change and national security, but you live in the operational world. Can you describe to us your role in the United States Army as the Senior Climate Advisor?
Thanks, Kate. And it's great to be back with CNAS and appreciate the invitation to participate in this panel. So my role with the Department of the Army as the Senior Climate Advisor is really to help break down some stovepipes that have existed for a little while. The Army's been doing work on climate for a number of years, and there's been a lot of good work done over the last decade to try to get after this issue of climate resilience and energy security, but it hasn't gotten the attention that I would say it's quite deserved. And Secretary Wormuth deserves a lot of credit for her leadership and her vision to help elevate climate change in a very meaningful way. And then similarly, Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary Hicks within OSD deserve credit as well for their leadership in elevating these issues within the department broadly. But as you know, within DoD, issues become stovepipe very easily. People are just trying very hard to get after solving problems. But one of the roles that I'm trying to play within the Army is to make sure that in addition to amplifying this work, that we are also talking with our sister services, with OSD, and with other federal agencies that have a lot of expertise and resources to get after the same problems that the Army is trying to solve, whether that's with energy resilience, whether that's trying to better understand how climate change is going to impact specific installations across the country or where we have an overseas presence. And a lot of that expertise, you may be surprised, resides outside of the Army. It resides with organizations like the Department of Energy and their national labs, for example. And so one of my roles is to make sure that in addition to talking to my counterparts in the services so that we're all sharing information and not reinventing the wheel, that we're also talking with other federal members of the federal family like Department of Energy, USDA, and Department of Interior.
That's great. So earlier this year, the Army released the United States Army Climate Strategy. Can you give us an overview of what the process was in creating that document, and then an overview of what some of the more salient points are?
Great, Kate. I want to point out that the Army was the first service to put out a climate strategy. Not that I try to make that point wherever I can at the expense of my sister services, but the Navy did put out a strategy in the summer, and the Air Force just put out a strategy a week and a half ago. So all the services are well represented in this space. Before I answer what's in the Army climate strategy, I just want to take a step back and explain why the Army decided to put out a strategy to begin with, because I think it connects with the previous discussion that the first panel was having. The simplest explanation is the Army recognizes that we're in a climate crisis. From a strategic standpoint, climate change is having an impact on Army readiness and the health and safety of our soldiers and families. Not 20 or 30 years from now, but right now, right? We're seeing soldiers that are having to deploy to. We're seeing persistent wildfires impacting our installations out in the Midwest. Fort Hunter Lake, for example, sees this on a seasonal basis. We're seeing National Guardsmen have to deploy more regularly to fight those wildfires. We're seeing heat extremes degrade our ability to do training in certain environments like the Southeast, where humidity and temperature are having a real impact on the health of soldiers in certain installations, for example. We also know that climate change is driving new missions for the Army. Secretary Wormuth just announced earlier this year the reactivation of the 11th Airborne up in Alaska. So we're starting to resource a more permanent presence up in Alaska. Probably a little bit sooner than we may have otherwise been because of the fact that the Arctic is warming at twice the rate as the rest of the world. It's not a bad thing to have to put resources back up in Alaska, but it does require some hard choices as we're trying to figure out how we resource our posture in the Indo-Pacific and how we resource our balance our forces in Europe as well. So these are things that we have to think through, and these are all driven by climate effects on the Army. So we know that we're not insulated from climate effects, and we have to take this issue seriously, which is why Secretary Wormuth directed the Army staff to put out a strategy. So we put out the strategy in February, and then I was very glad to announce that last week we put out an implementation plan. Our efforts are only so good as our ability to execute. So the strategy was what we plan to do, and then the implementation plan is how we're going to do it. So we're actually pinning the rose on people and making people responsible for how we're going to get after this over the next several years. The strategy itself came together as a whole of Army effort. So we worked across all the Army major commands, working with folks at the installation level to make sure that the stuff we were saying we're going to do is actually implementable, it's actionable. And I would say that if you go back, October, November of last year, and we're in some of those red team conversations, it's we were really at the time being aggressive in terms of the milestones that we're trying to set for ourselves in terms of 2035, 2050 electrification or hybrid electrification of our tactical vehicles, for example. I would say today, based on where we know industry is at, based on where we know the technology is moving, those milestones are pretty solid. So we're actually we probably could have been more aggressive and pulled those milestones further left if we wanted to. Just to give you a quick highlight of the strategy in itself, there are three areas that we're focused on. One is installations, and that's really about making our installations more resilient against climate effects, making them more energy resilient so that if the grid goes down outside of the fence, that we can still stay up and be able to do the mission of fighting the nation's wars, being able to deploy our forces. The second area that we're focused on is on what we call acquisition and logistics. A lot of the focus is on what I had just mentioned with hybrid electrification and electrification of our vehicles out to 2035 and 2050. A lot of operational energy focus. But I would also say we're trying to elevate climate and the risk of climate change in our supply chains as well. I think COVID really focused the attention of the brittleness of our supply chains in a very meaningful way. We used to only look at supply chain risk from what are nefarious actors trying to put in our supply chains in order to have some disruptive effect on the Army or the department. But we also know there are physical vulnerabilities that we have to pay attention to, whether that's from a pandemic or because of extreme weather or severe environmental change. So we have to be mindful of that. And the third area that we're focused on is training the force to understand how climate change is going to impact the way that they do their job, whether that's from the severe health impacts from being exposed to heat extremes, or just understanding that these effects are not linear. They're going to continue to change exponentially, and we need to be adaptable.
So looking at the range of operational issues that you deal with on a daily basis, what would you say is one of the more pressing concerns that you have when you look at the landscape?
So I'd say the most pressing operational concern we have is probably how do we make sure that we can continue to train and deploy our forces in a climate extreme environment, specifically from our installations. As I had said, our installations are feeling the pressures from either cold weather snap like we saw in Texas February of last year, or extreme heat like we saw this year. Both those extremes are really bad for the civilian grid that we rely on in order to power our facilities, including those task and mission critical facilities that we rely on to train out our installations or deploy our forces. And we have a goal that by 2040, we want to be able to have carbon-free generation, self-contained on our installations, combined with battery storage and microgrids, so that if there's an issue with the civilian electric grid, if the grid goes down, we can still do everything that we need to do, training on post, or deploy those mission critical forces from our installations, from the forts to the ports, whether that's the seaports or airports, regardless of what's happening outside the fence line. That is the biggest challenge that we face today. We have a goal by 2040 to be able to do that across all of our installations, have 100% of our critical missions covered. Folks will look at me and say 2040, 18 years, that sounds like a long time. We can't snap our fingers and get it done overnight, and we're already getting after this. Last year, fiscal year 22, we turned on 40 megawatts of new electricity generation on our installations across 9 installations. We've got a plan to get 50 megawatts on in 23. So we're getting after this. We've got 27 operational microgrids already online. We've got another 50 that are in development. These are all things that we have to do as we build towards that 2040 end state of having 100% of our installations covered. And people may say, well, is this just for a climate contingency? It's not just for a climate contingency. This is all about readiness of the force for any range of contingencies. It used to be this article of faith that the fight started over there, wherever over there may be. But we know that in the future, the fight may well start at home, right? There's going to be in a future contingency there may be an attack on the civilian electric grid to try to keep us from deploying our forces into the fight, slow them down, or stop them entirely. So the work that we're doing to make sure that we're resilient from the next extreme weather event, the next superstorm, is the same work that's going to make it so that if there's a cyber intrusion on the grid, we can still deploy our forces into the fight and not be able to not be unencumbered. We can still do what the nation requires us to do, which is, as I said, fight and win the nation's wars.
So we'll touch a couple of times on the impact of heat on civilians and training installations. And I want to turn the conversation over to Hope, who has covered this issue. So Hope, you covered an aspect of the effects of climate change that we might not always think about, which is the individual human impact. And the toll on service members specifically. DoD recently released a report looking at the effects of climate change and rising temperatures on training, specifically at Fort Benning. So can you give us an overview of what the recent report found?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. So this was a 5-year report, I think it was 2017 to 2021, and focused entirely on heat injuries at Fort Benning, Georgia. And why Fort Benning? Again, it's in that southeast region that Will talked about that gets very, very hot and is increasingly getting hotter. But it's also the home to a lot of entry-level training for both officers and enlisted soldiers. And that was something that the report talked about, is it's sort of the convergence of these two factors, like this new intensity of training and the heat on top of that is what creates a lot of these heat injuries. So we've seen heat exhaustion specifically climbing significantly year after year after year. Now, another interesting thing about this report is that it was written, authored by some of the founders of the Army Heat Center out at Fort Benning. And the Army, to their credit, is really out ahead of this, creating, this little entity that studies this, that has climate summits and heat summits to say, okay, how can we better protect our troops? What do we need to be doing differently now that the heat, again, it's not something we can ignore. We have, 2,000 heat injuries over the course of these 5 years that were studied. And if we can get at them early, then there's a high chance of survival. But ignoring that and saying, tough it out, this is just part of training, that's when you end up with those fatalities. So a couple of interesting things I think the Army is doing in regard to that effort is giving out water cards to soldiers where you can say, okay, how hydrated are you? Like, show me on your card, how are you documenting this? And then something that they were considering per this report, and something that I followed up on, was having medical personnel who are basically qualified to administer temperature checks on site, because that is a really key indicator that something is wrong if you see core body temperature climbing.
So it sounds like the Army has a couple of proactive motions in effect. What would you recommend that the other services might want to take away from what the Army is doing?
Well, I immediately think of the Marine Corps, which to this day does not have a heat center, but it also has some major military bases. You think Camp Lejeune down in North Carolina. You think Parris Island, which boot camp in South Carolina. It's a very Yuma, Arizona. So it has some of the hottest bases. And like the Army, the Marine Corps has like safe to train, like a flag system where black flag means forget it, we're not going on that hike today. And then there's a series of kind of lesser indicators. But then how do you make up that training? I mean, that's not a perfect solution. So whether you have to say, okay, we have this many dangerous days to make up the training, maybe we need to take it indoors, spend more time in the simulators, or maybe we need to go on more sort of, TDY, or maybe there's a more gradual ramp up. And this is something I think that is true of both services, where if you have sort of a more gradual approach to hikes with combat loads and heat, ultimately you can't get away from heat. And I think it's important to remember that the military services operate and deploy to a lot of very hot places. So you could say this is good training, but you have to be smart about how you train. And I think just the profile of this problem is rising. And so you can't overlook it. And even at a lower level, leaders, commanders need to be informed about what they should be looking for.
I'm also cognizant of the military culture too, right? The tough it out mentality. Do you see the military culture interacting with some of the outcomes that we've seen and how that might be addressed in the future?
I actually have done some informal polls of officers, enlisted troops that I know, just to kind of put out feelers. Somebody told me, oh, just rub dirt on it, to get to your point. So I think it's all about communication and understanding that this is something that will take down the strongest person if they're unprepared or if they're not acclimated. And again, that comes from the lowest level up. If you're hearing that at boot camp, I think there are some issues that are communicated really effectively that are kind of known risk factors for a long time. You don't want to throw someone in the pool who doesn't know how to swim and, make them tread for half an hour in the deep end. So I think it's how you frame it and saying, this is not an issue of toughness. This is about what the body can handle, and we're working with the conditions that we have.
Well, thank you for that. I want to bring back Admiral Richardson and Daniel Silverberg to open the panel up to some questions that we've received from the audience. The first question I'll pose to the group. So thinking about the Arctic as the new operational space, or one that we're thinking about, certainly Will touched on the fact that the Army has some plans underway. What are some of the capabilities that we need to think about? The big question always comes up about icebreakers, right? Which that capability largely rests in the Coast Guard and largely rests in only 2 icebreakers. So I'd love to get the panel's thoughts on what some investments or what some capabilities are that we need to think about up there. I'll start with Admiral Richardson.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. First of all, the question in the chat, if I read it right, was, hey, we're having trouble building the number of icebreakers we need to really secure that space, get the appropriate access, and should they therefore, move into the DoD budget. I think, it's a question I faced in testimony just about every single time I testified. And it's, to be honest, it's not a very interesting question to me, right? You just have to sort of zoom out one click on the thing to realize the money's going to have to come from somewhere, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, but I think we can be creative in terms of how we allocate, and sort of both appropriate and authorize that money. there are a lot of people building icebreakers in the world right now that could do the work for us. And so if we were flexible enough in that, we could get some very capable icebreakers. Right now, I think, our shipbuilding industry, it's a matter of prioritization. It's building a lot of things right now. And so this is an area where, sort of a multinational approach might help us, even as we build our domestic capability. I think other capabilities besides icebreaking, though, it's very difficult to communicate that far north. And so, the satellite constellation that supports communications up in the Arctic, and then just, getting up there. We talk about climate change in terms of, turning it into an area that's super accessible but it's still a very harsh environment. We sent a strike group up there in 2019, and it was very. We learned a lot of lessons. We hadn't sent that many ships that far north in a long time, and just in terms of managing the sea state, managing the cold, the ice, and everything else on deck, there's just a lot of practical lessons that come from operating up there. So let's start sending folks up there as priorities allow, really kind of moving it up in the priorities. We'll start to learn a lot more lessons about the technologies that can help. Unmanned, I think, is another area, right? It's tough to operate up there. So what, if an unmanned type of technology can get it done up there, why send people up there?
Dan, I'll turn the question to you. What types of investments would you like to see DoD making when we think about the Arctic as a area of operations?
I would 100% agree with what the Admiral said in terms of thinking more cautiously about icebreakers. We might need them. They don't necessarily have to be ours. The DoD and the Navy doesn't necessarily have to pay for them. But I want to take a step back from that and challenge the assumption that just because it's going to be an accessible area and other countries are going to be operating there, that our approach should be to match Russia and China ship for ship, rather than putting our efforts into creating the legal and policy framework that is going to restrict activities in the Arctic. If we can't stop Russia and China from exploiting the resources there, and other countries, then of course we need to think very seriously right now about how do we deploy military force to challenge those, and we don't want to be left out in the cold, so to speak. But that said, I think a lot of the congressional conversation focuses on icebreakers, kinetic activity, ships, rather than how do we apply U.S. diplomatic muscle to create a legal framework for the Arctic so that all nations benefit, that even our adversaries, similar to what we saw in the Lebanon-Israel context, we work with our adversaries to find a way to ensure that the Arctic does not become further denuded and climate challenged.
Will, I'll turn it to you, thinking more on the ground force capability after focusing on the naval side of things. What are some of the areas where we should be thinking about that require investment for ground forces in the Arctic?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So one area that jumps to mind is infrastructure. I mean, we're struggling right now, even below the Arctic Circle, just to stay ahead of some of the changes, at our installations at Wainwright or Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson. And I think the Army, Secretary Wormuth and General McConville are focused on just making sure we're investing in adequate infrastructure, both barracks, family housing, the facilities up there, to make sure that we are able to posture the force that we have even south of the Arctic Circle before we even get into conversations about operating in those more extreme climates. So that's thing one. And then if we're talking about having a ground force that's operating up in the farther parts of the Arctic Circle, what that looks like, what kind of vehicles we're going to need in order to operate in those cold weather extremes, if they're going to be weatherized to be able to operate at the -40, -60 degree temperatures that that environment requires. Is going to take some real science and engineering that the Army has. We have a cold weather research center up in New Hampshire and not up in Alaska that does this work. Similarly, we're looking at contingency basing for these kinds of cold weather environments, where we're bringing in battery technology that can operate at these cold weather extremes as well, so that we can support soldiers that are maybe living out in that kind of environment. So these are all things that we have to think about. But I think Daniel made a good point too about not just trying to match our strategic competitors one for one for ship for the icebreakers, but we have to take a step back and figure out what kind of presence we want, what that presence is going to look like on an enduring basis, and then use that to sort of figure out the resourcing and long-term effort.
I'll flip the question on its head to hope, looking at the hot weather situation. A lot of what you talked about was kind of management changes that would address this issue, but were there any areas of investment that you saw that could benefit soldiers training in hotter environments?
So one thing that I found really interesting, and I think is an increasing trend, is linking up the impacts of climate change to combat effectiveness and how the warfighter fights. So I'm going to expand that question a little bit. But I just came from the Association of the United States Army's conference. There were at least 3 climate change related events that were focused on operations, and that's a new focus as far as I'm concerned. And a couple of things that I found really intriguing were sort of pitching this hybrid electric drive vehicle shift that's already happening, already underway, already funded, and talking about how it actually makes warfighters more combat effective. They're silent. The logistics tail is less. If you've got that reliable battery and efficient transmission, you actually, have something over on the enemy. And, I'm also seeing interesting initiatives. This one's actually out of Congress, but to, start kind of offering more meatless options at dining halls in the Navy specifically. Just again, direct impact to the warfighter, beyond even the heat issue, but saying climate change matters to you. How is this going to impact your life? This is going to be harder to get. This is going to be, we're going to have to watch our carbon footprint. What's that going to look like for you? So I think that's the conversation that's happening now. And I'm very interested to see even the small initiatives that are happening to kind of make that, commonly understood at the lower levels.
Well, I want to respect everyone's time. We thank our panelists so much for joining us today and providing a great overview of both the strategic and the operational challenges facing the United States military with respect to climate change. Please do follow along as CNAS continues this conversation on this cross-cutting issue. Later this fall, as Paul mentioned at the beginning, we'll have a panel focused on very specific regional implications for climate change and national security. So we encourage you all to follow along, and we thank you so much for joining us today.